Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I never thought I'd have to fight for something as simple as my childhood memories. But when my stepmom threw out every single photo of me growing up, I was devastated. And when I confronted my dad about it, he didn't apologize. He told me to get over it. What happened next tore our family apart in ways I could never have imagined. It started with a phone call from my stepmom. Her voice was breezy, almost cheerful, as she told me about the decluttering project she and my dad had embarked on. "We're trying to make space," she said. I figured it was time to get rid of some old junk. At the time, I didn't think much of it. My stepmom was always organizing something. Closets, kitchen drawers, even my dad's garage. It had become a regular occurrence, so her latest project didn't raise any red flags. I nodded along, distracted by work, and said something like, "Sounds productive." It wasn't until that weekend, when I visited their house, that I realized what she'd done. I was sorting through some boxes in the living room, looking for my mom's old photo albums, the ones filled with pictures of my childhood. I wanted to scan a few for a scrapbook I'd been working on, something to keep my mom's memory alive. "Hey," I called out to my stepmom. "Where are the photo albums? The ones from the attic?" Her face froze. For a moment, she looked genuinely startled, as if she hadn't expected me to ask. Then she quickly recovered, smoothing her expression into something neutral. "Oh," she said, her tone overly casual. "I threw those out." I stared at her, convinced I must have misheard. "You what?" "I threw them out," she repeated, shifting uncomfortably. "They were taking up space." My chest tightened as her words sank in. Those weren't just random pictures. They were my childhood. Photos of my first birthday, my kindergarten graduation, summer trips to the park with my mom before she passed away. They were the only tangible connection I had left to her. "Why would you do that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "They were old and dusty. We needed the room." "Old and dusty?" I repeated, incredulous. "Do you have any idea what those meant to me?" Her expression shifted, hardening slightly. "Look, I didn't know they were so important to you. You never mentioned them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't like I needed to explicitly say, "Please don't throw away my childhood memories." That should have been obvious. I stormed out of the room, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief. My first instinct was to find my dad. Surely, he didn't know about this. He would understand why I was upset and make things right. But when I found him in the backyard, trimming some hedges, his reaction wasn't what I expected. "Dad," I said, my voice still trembling, "do you know what she did?" "She threw out Mom's photo albums. All the pictures of me growing up." He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the hedge clippers. "I heard," he said, his tone nonchalant. I blinked, certain I must have misheard again. "You heard? And you're okay with that?" He sighed heavily, like I was being unreasonable. "They're just photos," he said. "You need to get over it." "Just photos?" I repeated, my voice rising. They were all I had left of Mom. He set the clippers down and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We can't hold on to everything forever," he said. "Sometimes, you have to let go of the past and focus on the present." His words hit me like a slap. This wasn't just about the photos. It was about the way my stepmom's influence had changed him. The dad I'd grown up with would have never dismissed my feelings like this. I walked away from that conversation feeling shattered. The photos were gone, and so, it seemed, was the father I used to know. I spent the rest of the weekend in a daze, barely speaking to anyone. My stepmom avoided me, while my dad acted as if nothing had happened. When I left their house that Sunday, I knew something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was the start of a deeper fracture in our relationship. The photos were gone, and I couldn't get them back. But the pain of losing them was nothing compared to the realization that my dad and stepmom didn't seem to care. And that, more than anything, was what I couldn't get over. I spent the rest of that weekend in a haze, barely able to process what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photo albums, images of my mom holding me as a baby, snapshots of family vacations, candid pictures of us laughing at some long-forgotten joke, all gone. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But more than anything, I was hurt. How could my dad let this happen? On Sunday morning, I decided I couldn't leave without talking to him. I found him in the kitchen, sipping his coffee like it was any other day. "Dad, we need to talk," I said, my voice tight. He glanced up, sensing my tone. "What's on your mind?" "What's on my mind?" I repeated, incredulous. The fact that your wife threw out all of Mom's photo albums and you're acting like it's no big deal. He sighed and set down his mug, clearly bracing himself. Look, I get that you're upset. Upset doesn't even begin to cover it, I interrupted. Do you realize what she did? She threw away the only memories I had of Mom. How could you let that happen? Those albums have been sitting in the attic for years, he said, his tone matter of fact. It's not like you looked at them every day. That doesn't mean they weren't important to me. I shot back, my voice rising. You don't just throw something like that away because it's taking up space. He rubbed his temples, clearly annoyed. You can't hold on to the past forever, he said dismissively. They're just photos. Get over it. His words felt like a punch to the gut. Just photos? I said, my voice trembling. They were all I had left of Mom. He looked at me, his expression hardening. She was trying to help, he said, defending my stepmom. She didn't know they were so important to you. She knew, I said through gritted teeth. You don't just throw away someone else's memories without thinking about what they mean. And even if she didn't, why didn't you stop her? Why didn't you say anything? His jaw tightened. Because it's not worth fighting over, he said. We're trying to make this house livable, not a museum for the past. A museum for the past? I repeated, my voice breaking. Is that how you see it? Like Mom's life, like my life, doesn't matter anymore? You're overreacting, he said, his tone sharp now. I know you miss her, but this isn't healthy. You need to let it go. I stared at him, struggling to find the words to convey just how deeply he'd hurt me. Let it go? I said finally. That's easy for you to say. You have your memories. I have nothing now, because of her, and because you didn't care enough to stop it. He stood up, his face clouded with frustration. This isn't about not caring, he said. It's about moving forward. You can't keep clinging to the past, expecting everyone else to do the same. His words left me stunned. I'd always thought of my dad as my rock, the one person I could count on to understand me, to protect the things that mattered most. But now, he was defending the very person who had taken so much from me, acting like I was the one in the wrong. Moving forward doesn't mean erasing everything that came before, I said, tears streaming down my face. You're not moving forward, you're letting her rewrite the past. And I won't let you do that to me. I didn't wait for his response. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and grief. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. My dad wasn't the person I thought he was anymore. And as much as it hurt, I couldn't keep pretending otherwise. The drive home that afternoon was quiet, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on me like a stone. I kept replaying his words in my head, each one cutting deeper than the last. They're just photos. Get over it. You're overreacting. But I wasn't overreacting. Those photos were more than just pictures. They were pieces of my life, pieces of my mom, and pieces of myself that I could never get back. And no matter how much my dad tried to downplay it, what happened wasn't okay. That conversation marked the beginning of a rift between us, one that would only grow wider in the weeks and months to come. For the first time, I began to question not just my relationship with my dad, but my place in his life, and whether there was still room for me in the family he was so eager to rebuild. For days after the confrontation, my mind was a storm of anger and sadness. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop replaying my dad's words. They're just photos. Get over it. The dismissal stung. But what hurt even more was the realization that he'd chosen to side with my stepmom. Over me, over the memories of my mom, over everything that had once mattered to both of us. I kept asking myself how we'd gotten here. My dad hadn't always been this way. When I was younger, he was attentive and supportive, the kind of parent I could turn to for anything. After my mom passed, he was my anchor. Even through his grief, he made sure I felt loved and cared for. But since marrying my stepmom, everything had changed. At first, I thought it was just the adjustment of blending a family, something we'd all need time to get used to. But over the years, it felt like she'd become the center of his world, while I was pushed further to the edges. Her influence was subtle, but undeniable. I started digging deeper, trying to understand the dynamics of their relationship. When had things shifted so drastically? Was it when she moved into our home, rearranging everything to fit her tastes? Or was it when she started making small comments about how I should respect her authority because she was my dad's wife? The more I thought about it, the more patterns I began to see. It wasn't just the photo albums. It was the way she'd slowly taken over the house, removing traces of my mom without ever consulting me. The way my dad deferred to her on everything, even when it affected me. The way she subtly reframed our family's history, as if my mom was just a footnote in the story of their lives. I tried talking to a few family friends, hoping for some clarity. She's good for him, they'd say about my stepmom. He's happier now. Happier? I'd repeat, incredulous. At what cost? They'd shrug, uncomfortable with my reaction. He deserves to move on, one said, as if that excused everything. I wasn't saying my dad didn't deserve happiness. Of course he did. But it felt like his version of moving on was erasing not just my mom, but me too. The realization hit me like a gut punch. I wasn't just losing the physical remnants of my childhood. I was losing my dad. It wasn't that he didn't love me anymore. At least, I didn't think so. But his priorities had shifted, and I was no longer at the top of the list. His relationship with my stepmom seemed to take precedence over everything, including the bond we'd spent years building after my mom passed. It became clearer every time I visited their house. My stepmom's framed photos dominated the walls, while the ones of my mom had quietly disappeared. Furniture I grew up with had been replaced, and even the way the house smelled, her overly floral air fresheners, felt foreign. It was like the home I'd grown up in wasn't mine anymore. One evening, after a particularly bad day, I called a childhood friend who'd known me before everything changed. "Do you ever feel like you're disappearing?" I asked, tears choking my voice. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. Like the person you were doesn't exist anymore," I said. "Like everyone's rewriting the story, and you're the only one who remembers how it really happened." She was quiet for a long moment. "You're not disappearing," she said finally. "But it sounds like they're trying to make you feel like you don't matter as much." Her words stung because they were true. My stepmom's actions, and my dad's complicity, made it clear that they didn't see me as an equal part of the family. I was an afterthought, a reminder of a past they were eager to leave behind. In that moment, I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep trying to hold onto a version of my dad who no longer existed. And I couldn't keep hoping my stepmom would magically understand the damage she'd caused. If they wanted to rewrite the past, I couldn't stop them. But I wasn't going to let them erase me along with it. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it gave me a sense of clarity. My relationship with my dad might never go back to the way it was, but I could still fight for the pieces of myself and my mom that mattered. Even if they couldn't see it, I knew my worth, and I wasn't going to let their choices define who I was. After the realization that my dad wasn't going to support me, I turned to other family members, hoping they might understand. Surely, someone else would see why this wasn't just about old photos. I started with my aunt, my mom's younger sister, who had always been a grounding presence in my life. "She threw out all your photos," my aunt said, her voice rising in disbelief. Her eyes widened as she processed the news, her hands gripping the edge of her kitchen table. "How could she do that? Didn't your dad say anything?" "He defended her," I said bitterly. "He told me to get over it." My aunt shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's unacceptable," she said firmly. "Those weren't just photos. They were memories, pieces of your life. Your stepmom had no right to touch them, let alone throw them away." For the first time in days, I felt a small sense of validation. Someone understood. Someone saw how wrong this was. But that feeling didn't last long. When I shared the story with other family members, the reactions were far less sympathetic. "You can't live in the past," one cousin said, shrugging as if it was no big deal. "Maybe it's time to move on." "Move on?" I repeated, incredulous. "From my own childhood?" "Well, yeah," he said, clearly uncomfortable with my anger. "Your dad's right. You shouldn't hold on to every little thing. It's just clutter." "Clutter?" I snapped. Those pictures were all I had left of my mom. They weren't junk. They were part of my life. But no matter how much I tried to explain, he didn't get it. To him, and others like him, this was just a case of me being overly sentimental. Their words stung, not because they disagreed with me, but because they dismissed my feelings so easily. The divide only deepened when my stepmom started sharing her version of the story. "I didn't know they were important," she claimed whenever someone brought it up. "I was just trying to tidy up. If I'd known, I would have left them alone." Her words might have sounded reasonable to someone who didn't know her, but I did. The way she avoided my eyes whenever I brought it up, the way she quickly changed the subject whenever someone pressed for details, it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an accident. She knew exactly what she was doing. "She's trying to erase mom," I told my aunt during another conversation. "She's been doing it for years, getting rid of little things here and there, replacing them with her own stuff. Now it's the photos. What's next?" My aunt sighed heavily. It's not right, she said. But you know how your dad is. He doesn't want conflict. He'll always side with her because it's easier. That comment stuck with me. My dad's refusal to stand up for me, or for my mom's memory, wasn't just a betrayal. It was a choice. And it was becoming increasingly clear that he'd chosen his new life, his new wife, over the family we'd once been. I tried to talk to a few more relatives, hoping for support. Some were kind but hesitant, not wanting to get involved. Others took my dad's side, repeating the same tired phrases about moving on and not dwelling on the past. One family member even said, "You're lucky your dad found someone to take care of him. You should be grateful." Grateful? I snapped. For what? For someone who's erasing my entire childhood? For a dad who doesn't care about how I feel? The conversation ended awkwardly, leaving me feeling more isolated than ever. I realized then that this wasn't just about the photos anymore. It was about something bigger. The way my family had fractured, the way my dad had changed, and the way I was being pushed out of my own story. I knew I couldn't force people to see things from my perspective, but that didn't make their dismissal any less painful. Every time someone brushed off my feelings or sided with my stepmom, it felt like another door closing, another piece of support slipping away. But not everyone turned their back on me. My aunt remained steadfast, offering words of encouragement and reminding me that I had every right to feel the way I did. "You're not crazy," she said. "What they did was wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Her words gave me a glimmer of strength, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But the growing divide within my family felt insurmountable, and I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever go back to the way they were. Deep down, I already knew the answer. A few weeks after the ordeal with the photo albums, my dad called a family meeting. The request felt odd. My dad wasn't the type to formally gather everyone unless something big was happening. My mind raced with possibilities as I made my way to their house, a sinking feeling settling in my chest. When I arrived, my stepmom greeted me with her usual overly cheerful smile, the kind that always seemed forced. My dad was already seated at the dining table, papers spread out in front of him. "Come in, sit down," he said, gesturing toward an empty chair. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for some kind of revelation. I braced myself as my dad cleared his throat and said, "We've made some updates to our wills, and we thought it was important to let you know." At first, his words didn't fully register. Wills? Updates? What was he talking about? Then he dropped the bombshell. "We've decided to leave the house and most of the assets to your stepmom," he said, his tone calm, as if this was the most logical thing in the world. "It's only fair. She's been there for me through everything." The room went silent, except for the faint sound of my stepmom's fork clinking against her plate as she pretended not to notice the tension. "What about me?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. "What about mom's things?" He hesitated, avoiding my eyes. "We're leaving some sentimental items for you," he said vaguely, "but you're doing fine on your own. You don't need much." The words hit me like a freight train. I stared at him, trying to process what he just said. "You're leaving everything to her?" I asked, my voice rising. "Even the house that mom helped buy? Even the things that were hers?" "It's not everything," he said defensively. "We're setting aside a few items for you. Things that are meaningful." Meaningful? I repeated, my anger boiling over. "What does that even mean? You're giving away everything mom worked for to someone who threw out all our memories like they were trash." "That's enough," my dad said sharply. His tone startled me. It was the same tone he used when I was a kid and had crossed some invisible line. "This isn't up for debate. Your stepmom has been by my side through thick and thin, and she deserves to be taken care of. And I don't." I shot back. The tension in the room was suffocating. My stepmom finally spoke, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "We just want to make sure everyone is treated fairly," she said, her eyes darting to my dad for backup. "It's not about taking anything away from you." "Not about taking anything away?" I laughed bitterly. "That house was mom's. Her name was on the deed before you even met. And now you're giving it to her like it's nothing." "It's not nothing," my dad said, his voice growing louder. "But you have your own life, your own career. You don't need this house. She does." In that moment, it felt like every ounce of love and trust I'd had for him was being stripped away. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about what it represented. My mom's contributions, her sacrifices, her memory, all of it was being erased, just like the photos. I left the house that evening in a daze, my mind spinning with anger and disbelief. How could he justify this? How could he act like it was fair to leave me with scraps while giving everything to someone who had spent years undermining my place in the family. I thought about calling my aunt, but I didn't even know how to begin explaining what had just happened. Instead, I sat in my car, staring at the dashboard, replaying his words over and over in my head. You don't need much. The implication was clear. I didn't matter. Not enough to fight for, not enough to honor. In his eyes, my stepmom had become more important than the daughter he'd once sworn to protect. The meeting marked a turning point in our relationship. Up until that moment, I'd held onto a shred of hope that things could be repaired, that my dad could see reason and we could find a way to move forward. But now, that hope was gone. This wasn't just about money or assets. It was about my dad's choices that showed me exactly where I stood in his new life. I knew I couldn't let this go without a fight. My mom had worked too hard to build a life for us, and I wasn't going to let her memory be erased so easily. But I also knew that standing up for myself would come at a cost I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. As I drove away from their house that night, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If my dad couldn't see my worth, then maybe I needed to stop seeking his approval. Maybe it was time to fight for myself, even if that meant losing him in the process. The days following the inheritance bombshell were a blur of emotions: anger, sadness, and a heavy sense of betrayal. Every time I thought about my dad's decision, it felt like another piece of my connection to him was crumbling away. My mom's side of the family was equally outraged when I told them what had happened. Your mom worked so hard for that house, my uncle said during a heated phone call. His voice was tight with frustration, barely concealing his anger. She would have never wanted this. I know, I said, my voice trembling. But what can I do? It's his house now. He can do whatever he wants. That doesn't make it right, my uncle shot back. She built that life with him, for both of you. If he wants to move on with someone else, fine, but he doesn't get to erase her contributions or your place in this family. His words struck a chord, but the idea of going up against my dad in court felt impossible. How could I fight the man who had once been my rock, the person who had comforted me when I cried, who had taught me how to ride a bike and told me stories about my mom? And yet, I couldn't just sit back and let my stepmom take everything without a fight. After days of deliberation, I decided to consult a lawyer. I didn't know if I had a case, but I needed to understand my options. The idea of sitting across from a stranger and airing my family's dirty laundry was daunting, but I knew it was a necessary step. The lawyer I met with, a calm and methodical woman named Ms. Carter, listened intently as I explained the situation. I told her about my mom's contributions to the house, about the photo albums, and about the updated will that left almost everything to my stepmom. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. It's not uncommon for situations like this to arise, she said carefully, but it's going to be tricky. Unless your mom's name was still on the deed or there's a legal agreement specifying her share of the property, your dad has full control over what happens to it now. But it's not just about the house, I said, frustration bubbling up. It's about the principle. My mom's memory is being erased, and I'm being pushed out of the family she helped build. I understand, Ms. Carter said, her tone sympathetic. But the law deals in tangible assets, not emotions. If you want to fight this, you'll need evidence, documentation, witnesses, anything that proves your mom's contributions to the property or shows undue influence from your stepmom. The conversation left me both hopeful and overwhelmed. I had a path forward, but it wouldn't be easy. I started digging through old documents, hoping to find anything that could support my case. Bank statements, receipts, even old emails. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle I was trying desperately to put together. My aunt and uncle were invaluable during this process, offering both emotional and practical support. My aunt helped me sift through boxes of papers, while my uncle reached out to his own network to find anyone who might have known about my mom's role in purchasing the house. Meanwhile, the guilt of what I was doing gnawed at me. Every time I imagined my dad's reaction to a legal challenge, I felt sick to my stomach. How could I go through with this without completely destroying our relationship? And yet, every time I thought about my stepmom inheriting everything, about her smugly claiming the life my mom had built, my resolve hardened. The hardest part was gathering the courage to take the next step. Filing a formal challenge to my dad's will felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but I knew I had no other choice. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about standing up for my mom's memory, for everything she had worked so hard to build. Ms. Carter helped me prepare the paperwork, explaining each step of the process in detail. This isn't going to be easy, she warned me. Family cases rarely are. But if you're ready to move forward, I'll do everything I can to help. I nodded, my stomach churning with a mix of fear and determination. "I'm ready," I said, though part of me still wasn't sure if that was true. As I left her office that day, I felt the weight of what I was about to do settle heavily on my shoulders. I was about to take on not just my stepmom, but my dad, the person who had once been my greatest ally. The road ahead would be long and painful, but I knew in my heart that I couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about fighting for what was rightfully mine. It was about fighting for myself, for my place in a family that seemed intent on pushing me out. And as terrifying as it was, I knew it was a fight worth having. Just when I thought I was fighting this battle alone, I received a call that changed everything. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years. My mom's best friend, Elaine. Hearing her voice brought a flood of memories. Elaine had been like a second mom to me when I was little, always there with a warm hug and a kind word. "I heard what's been going on," she said gently, her tone a mix of sadness and determination. "I just want you to know, I'm here for you." Her words caught me off guard. After everything that had happened, I'd started to believe that no one else cared about what my mom had built or how it was being taken away. But Elaine's call felt like a lifeline. We met for coffee a few days later, and it was like stepping back in time. Elaine looked older, but her warmth was the same as ever. She reached across the table to take my hand, her eyes full of empathy. "Your mom would be devastated if she knew what they were doing," she said. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time trying to fight for my mom's memory, but hearing someone else acknowledge how wrong it all was felt like a validation I hadn't realized I needed. "She worked so hard for that house," Elaine continued. "I remember when she first told me about it, how proud she was to finally have a place where you could grow up and feel safe. She took on extra shifts, worked 2 jobs for a while, just to make sure everything was taken care of." Tears welled up in my eyes as she spoke. I'd always known my mom was a hard worker, but hearing Elaine's stories reminded me of just how much she'd sacrificed for us. "This isn't just about money," Elaine said firmly, her voice breaking through my thoughts. "It's about honoring her memory. Everything she did was for you, and she'd want you to stand up for yourself." Her words lit a fire in me. For weeks, I'd been torn between the guilt of challenging my dad and the anger of watching my stepmom take over everything my mom had built. But Elaine's support gave me clarity. This wasn't just about me. It was about protecting my mom's legacy. Elaine didn't just offer emotional support. She also helped me gather evidence for my case. She dug through old letters my mom had written, emails they'd exchanged, and even receipts from the early days of buying the house. Each piece of evidence felt like another piece of my mom's story, a reminder of how much she'd given to create the life we had. "You're not alone in this," Elaine said as she handed me a stack of papers. "Your mom might not be here anymore, but I'm here, and I'm going to help you see this through." For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope. Elaine's support reminded me that I wasn't fighting a losing battle. There were people who saw the truth, who understood what this fight meant, and who believed in me even when I doubted myself. Her presence also gave me strength to face the harder parts of the process. When my lawyer asked for more detailed accounts of my mom's contributions, Elaine helped fill in the gaps with stories I hadn't known or had forgotten. "She used to say you were her biggest motivation," Elaine told me one afternoon. "Everything she did was to give you a better life." Hearing that brought a new sense of determination. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting to protect the life my mom had worked so hard to build for us. Of course, the support from Elaine didn't erase all the challenges. My dad and stepmom were still firmly united, and the tension between us was worse than ever. But knowing I had Elaine in my corner made it easier to face them. When I told her about my doubts, the fear of losing my dad entirely, the guilt of going against him, she reminded me that standing up for myself didn't mean I didn't love him. "Sometimes love means holding people accountable," she said. "You can love your dad and still fight for what's right." Those words stuck with me. They became my mantra in the weeks that followed, a reminder that I wasn't fighting out of spite or anger, but out of love, for my mom, for myself, and for the truth. With Elaine's support, I finally felt like I had the strength to keep going. For the first time, I wasn't just fighting to be heard, I was fighting to win. It was only a matter of time before the tension exploded. I could feel it building every time I visited my dad's house or received an email from my lawyer with updates about the case. My stepmom had been quiet for weeks, avoiding direct confrontations, but the silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. I'd stopped by their house to pick up a few old books my aunt had found in storage, remnants of my childhood. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew something was off. My dad wasn't there, but my stepmom was waiting for me in the living room. arms crossed, and an unmistakable look of anger on her face. "We need to talk," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the stillness of the room. I hesitated, sensing where this was headed. "About what?" I asked cautiously. "You know what?" she snapped, standing up and pacing the room. "This ridiculous case you've started. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family?" Her words hit me like a slap, but I refused to let her see how much they stung. "This family?" I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling under the surface. "You mean the one you've been tearing apart since you got here?" Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely shocked by my response. "I'm tearing it apart?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "You're the one dragging your father into court. You're the one making everything about money." "This isn't about money," I said firmly. "It's about what's right. It's about Mom's memory, something you've been trying to erase since the day you moved in." Her face reddened, her composure slipping. "That's not true," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I challenged, stepping closer. "You threw out every photo of my childhood, every memory of Mom, like they were garbage. You've replaced everything in this house with your own things, and now you're taking everything she worked for. Don't pretend you didn't know exactly what you were doing." Her anger boiled over, and she stopped pacing to glare at me. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "Why can't you just move on? Your dad has. Why can't you?" "Because moving on doesn't mean erasing everything that came before you." I shot back, my voice rising. "This family fell apart the moment you threw out my photos. Don't act like I'm the one tearing it apart. You've been doing that since day one." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, it seemed like I'd hit a nerve. Her silence said more than any argument ever could. She wasn't just careless, she was intentional. The realization left me furious. "You don't care about this family," I continued, my voice trembling with emotion. "You care about control. You want everything to revolve around you, even if it means erasing my mom, erasing me." Her face turned a deeper shade of red, and she clenched her fists. "That's not true," she said through gritted teeth. "I've done nothing but try to make this family work. You're the one who can't let go of the past." I laughed bitterly. "Let go of the past? You don't get to decide when I'm ready to move on. And you don't get to rewrite my history just because it makes you uncomfortable." Her mask of control cracked completely. "I've had enough of this," she spat. "You're selfish, ungrateful, and spiteful. Do you have any idea what your dad has been through? What I've done for him? What you've done for him?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You mean alienating his daughter and destroying everything my mom built?" "Yeah, I see exactly what you've done." The conversation ended as abruptly as it started. My stepmom stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, my chest heaving, trying to process what had just happened. That confrontation confirmed everything I'd suspected. Her actions weren't thoughtless or accidental, they were calculated. She wasn't just trying to declutter a house. She was trying to rewrite a family's history, removing everything that didn't fit her version of events. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange sense of relief. The anger was still there, but so was clarity. I wasn't fighting a ghost anymore. I knew exactly who my stepmom was and what she was trying to do. And for the first time, I knew that standing up to her wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. Months of legal battles had taken their toll. The endless back and forth with lawyers, the emotional weight of reliving old memories, and the tension with my dad and stepmom had drained me in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were days I questioned if it was worth it, days when the thought of giving up and walking away felt like the easier option. But every time I thought about my mom, about her sacrifices, her love, and the life she'd worked so hard to build for me, I found the strength to keep going. This fight wasn't about greed or revenge. It was about protecting her legacy and standing up for the person she raised me to be. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my lawyer called with news. "Your dad has agreed to a compromise," Ms. Carter said. "He's willing to negotiate." The meeting to finalize the agreement was tense. Sitting across from my dad and stepmom in a sterile conference room, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what had been lost. My dad wouldn't look me in the eye, and my stepmom sat rigidly, her expression a mask of cold indifference. The agreement wasn't perfect. I didn't get the house or the majority of the assets, but I was able to secure a portion of the inheritance, as well as some of my mom's belongings. The most significant win, though, was reclaiming a few items that held deep sentimental value. Her wedding ring, a handwritten journal she'd kept during my early years, and a box of small keepsakes she cherished. When the meeting ended, my dad finally spoke to me directly. "I hope this brings you some closure," he said stiffly. I wanted to say so many things, to ask him how he could have let things get this far, to tell him how much he'd hurt me, but I held back. "It's not about closure," I said quietly. "It's about doing what's right." Walking out of that conference room felt like shedding a heavy weight. The fight was over, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. My relationship with my dad was fractured in ways I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. As for my stepmom, I knew there was no path forward for us. At first, that realization hurt. I had always clung to the idea that family meant unconditional love and support, that no matter how bad things got, there would always be a way back. But this experience had taught me a hard truth. Sometimes, the cost of protecting your truth is losing people who refuse to see it. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding. I spent time going through the items I'd recovered, carefully organizing my mom's belongings, and finding ways to incorporate them into my home. Her wedding ring now sat on a small display shelf in my bedroom, and her journal became a source of comfort on tough days. The resolution wasn't just about reclaiming those physical items. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself. For so long, I had let my dad's choices and my stepmom's manipulations make me feel small, like I didn't matter. But standing up for myself, even when it meant going through the pain of legal battles and strained relationships, reminded me of my own strength. Some friends and family members tried to mediate, encouraging me to reconcile with my dad. "Time heals all wounds," one relative said during a phone call. But I wasn't sure if that was true. Some wounds don't heal completely. They leave scars that remind you of what you've endured and how far you've come. Still, I found peace in knowing I had done everything I could. I had fought for my mom's memory and my own self-worth, and while I didn't win every battle, I walked away with my head held high. Looking back, I realized the fight had been about more than just the inheritance. It was about setting boundaries, about refusing to let anyone rewrite my history or erase my place in my family. It was about standing up for the person my mom had raised me to be, even when it meant standing alone. My relationship with my dad and stepmom might never recover, but I'd made peace with that. Sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go of the people who refuse to see your worth. And as painful as it had been, I knew I had done the right thing. For myself, for my mom, for the truth. The dust has settled now, and for the first time in what feels like forever, I can breathe again. The legal battles, the confrontations, the heartache, it's all behind me. Today, I'm focusing on rebuilding my life, piece by piece, starting with the things that truly matter. My mom's memory lives on in the few belongings I was able to save. Her wedding ring, her handwritten journal, and the keepsakes she held dear are now carefully preserved in my home. They're not just objects, they're pieces of her, reminders of the love and strength she poured into our lives. But it's more than that. I've created new memories that feel like my own, things that honor her while also allowing me to move forward. I've taken up gardening, a hobby she loved, and every time I see a new bloom in my backyard, I think of her. It's a quiet way of keeping her close, even as I carve out a future for myself. Do I wish things had turned out differently? Of course. In a perfect world, my dad would have stood by me, and we wouldn't have had to fight over something so deeply tied to my mom's legacy. In that world, my stepmom would have seen the harm she was causing and chosen to support, rather than erase, the family she married into. But life isn't perfect, and I've learned that sometimes, the people you expect to stand by you are the ones who let you down the hardest. It took time, but I've come to terms with the way things unfolded. My relationship with my dad is distant now, reduced to the occasional polite text or awkward holiday card. We've reached an unspoken understanding. Neither of us will bring up the past, and neither of us will pretend things are the same as they once were. As for my stepmom, I've accepted that we'll never have a relationship. She made her choices, and I've made mine. If that makes me the villain in her story, then so be it. The most important thing I've learned is that sometimes you have to fight for what matters, even if it means walking away from the people you thought would always be in your corner. That fight wasn't easy. It forced me to confront painful truths about my family, about myself, and about the things I'm willing to stand up for. But it also showed me just how strong I am. Today, I'm free from the shadows of that fight. I've built a life that feels authentic, one where I don't have to constantly defend my place or prove my worth. The scars are still there, but they're a reminder of what I've overcome, not a weight holding me back. My mom's voice echoes in my mind sometimes, a memory of something she used to say when life felt too overwhelming. You can't control what people do, but you can control how you respond. That's what I've done. I couldn't control my dad's decisions or my stepmom's actions, but I chose to respond in a way that honored my mom and protected myself. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning how to carry the past without letting it define you. It means taking the love, the lessons, and the strength from what you've lost and using them to build something new. And that's exactly what I'm doing. For myself. For my mom. For the life she wanted me to have. If that makes me the villain in someone else's story, I can live with that. At least now, I'm finally the hero of my own.